Well, to discuss the second day of the BRICS summit, we're joined in studio by political analyst Mr. Tshepo Kgadima. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Good evening.
Well, let's talk about, first of all, the balance of trade with China specifically. What is China's investment in South Africa?
Look, I think apart from investment that China has made in this country and intends to continue to make, one has to look on the trade front that we have since the restoration of bilateral relations between us and China. We've seen trade grow between the two nations. However, that has come with a trade deficit. And simply put, as much as we now have an opportunity of exporting iron ore, chrome ore, as well as manganese, coal, and other metals, so to speak, and other agricultural products, but the Chinese effectively now are exporting double or exporting to us double what we are exporting to them. So the trade is around, the deficit is around 100 billion rand. So you're looking at about 200 billion rand of trade we import from China, and we're exporting about 100 billion. And that is an issue that I think that President Ramaphosa needs to effectively lead his cabinet and rally the private sector to see how are we going to narrow that trade deficit. But we are not alone in terms of countries within the BRICS nations that have a very large trade deficit with China. If you look at Brazil, for example, they might supply soybeans, supply meat products, and supply iron ore and a number of other minerals. But also, again, there, they have a very large and widening trade deficit with China. So within the BRICS context, I think China has to do a lot more in terms of investing in productive capacity in other BRICS nations than currently effectively anchoring their geopolitical strategy on doing just trade, meaning that finished goods from China will find their way into the growing market within the BRICS nations, and very little will find that be imported. So the issue of trade barriers, such as import tariffs, for example, I think that is what, particularly for us, President Ramaphosa needs to pay particular attention to that issue. And the other thing that, of course, worries me, and I think should worry most other economic analysts, is that as much as we've recently seen that a big investment announcement was made, that BAIC is going to be investing in Guha to make electric motor vehicles, the issue there is that are they investing in order to find the market for their goods into the United States? Because South Africa is also a beneficiary country under the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. That simply puts that most of the bulk of our exports, 90% of our exports to the United States under AGOA, are by foreign-owned companies. And right now we, of course, know about the trade war that is ongoing between the United States and most European as well as China. The question is, I think that President Ramaphosa needs to go a step further of engaging even the Americans that they do not prematurely terminate our AGOA arrangement, so that as we get our house in order, as we develop more additional productive capacity in the country to supply, continue to supply under AGOA, and also to supply finished goods into China, Russia, as well as India. And I think that they are the steps that we need to follow to ensure that BRICS indeed does have a meaning for ordinary people in South Africa. And
if we also look at the African continent at large, I mean, China is perceived as a certain superpower in the continent. Do you think that that's benefiting us in any way? You've mentioned that they actually are sort of dumping their finished products on different African countries instead of having manufacturing plants or production happening in the countries to increase perhaps employment opportunities.
Look, what China has done right over many years was effectively of ensuring that whilst they had geared their key competencies in the manufacturing sector so that they can continue to be a factory to the world, low price or manufacture goods, finished goods, very cheaply and be able to compete on price. They also developed a domestic market. So if you look now in terms of what is unfolding in terms of the trade war, China effectively is going to come out of this unscathed because first they've developed key competencies. What they have done in the last 15 years, most of their foreign direct investment has not been so much in terms of buying minerals in countries such as Africa or within the continents such as Africa or as well as South America. They've effectively 64% of their foreign direct investment has been in acquiring intellectual property, technological know-how, to enable China to effectively be the key country globally when it comes to manufacturing processes. The question, therefore, that must be asked: what are we to do as South Africa? What are we to do as a smaller nation within the BRICS countries, as a smaller economy within the BRICS countries, to ensure that, in fact, we use our geostrategic position in the fact that, yes, we sit at the southern tip of Africa, both the Pacific as well as the Atlantic as well as the Indian Ocean. Now, 70% of the world's trade has to pass through South Africa's maritime borders. So our geostrategic importance, we need to use that to our advantage. And using that to our advantage, it means that in the area of blue economy, that's where we need to be rallying investment to ensure that we can now start to manufacture and offer services to the maritime or the blue economy sector. And at the same time, we also need to ensure that in terms of our position within the BRICS nations and within the continent of Africa, because we've got more developed infrastructure than many, and as we say, we are bringing other African countries on board, that we must ensure that whatever investment that comes from China or elsewhere in the world, the question we must constantly be asking is that, what is the multiplier effect of that investment? For example, China now has pledged $14 billion or $14.7 billion investment into South Africa. The question we must be asking, what is the multiplier effect? How many people will be employed? In which sectors of the economy? How many other businesses will be developed out of that $14.7 billion investment? And also, what is the level of ownership? Or are we going to be seeing a repatriation of profits? And I suspect that the next thing to follow will be a bilateral, a dual taxation treaty, which means that a Chinese company that is invested here might not necessarily pay tax here, will have to pay tax in their home country in China. Those are the issues that we need to pay particular attention to. But the key word there will be the multiplier effect of whatever investment that is being raised.
And I mean, just speaking about investments, I think the president is aiming to get about 100 billion in terms of a foreign investment into the country. Another question that comes up is, at what cost? Should the sovereignty of the country also not be a factor that we actually take into consideration?
Very important that we do that, because you have to bear in mind that particularly if you are going to be borrowing money, the borrower is a slave to the lender, and you become a servant to the one who lends you money. And we have to make sure that as South Africa, we can maintain our sovereignty. And in fact, when you look at the declaration coming out of this 2018 BRICS summit, is that of ensuring that there is equality of the nations, regardless of the economic size of any of the countries there. However, there are certain things that we need to do ourselves as a nation. So if we are borrowing money, my own assessment is that we have all the money we need to invest in this economy domestically. China, in fact, has done that. If you look at the growth of China, and for it to have sustained growth over the last 30 years and to be the #2 economy, soon to be the #1 economy globally, has been by mobilizing domestic investment and not so much of foreign investment, because China has been a closed shop as far as foreign direct investors are concerned. They are the ones that have been investing. We need to do the same thing. I believe that all the money is available in the country. There are, of course, certain legislative reforms we need to undertake to ensure that we can mobilize that money, unlock that capital domestically, and at the same time, until we deal with the issue of our public debt, whatever investment that is coming in effectively is just going to be going through a sieve that is going to go to waste. So those are the key issues that I think we need to be asking. So we need to go beyond the event, which is the BRICS summit. We need to be saying, well, between now and the next summit in 2019, what are the key things and how do we measure those, and how often do we reflect on those to ensure that indeed our membership of BRICS can offer tangible results? Ordinary people in the street can be able to identify with being part of BRICS or being citizens of South Africa, which is a member state to the BRICS nations. So multilateralism and all the multilateral organizations that we are members of, we need to have that conversation as often.
And just briefly, looking at one of the other members of the bloc, India, which is planning to actually open a number of embassies in Africa, how significant is that move? And can India be said to be trying to catch up with the other BRICS members?
Well, India may be more of wanting to catch up and maybe even exceed China. The story of India has not yet been told. And that is the story that I believe in the next decade is the story we're going to be focused on. India now, I believe that Prime Minister Modi has set the country on a sustainable growth trajectory economically. So over the next decade, we are going to see India becoming a much more agile foreign direct investor. So they are going in terms of diplomatic missions within the continent must be seen in that context of them now wanting to assert their economic muscle, which now is a lot more stronger to ensure that they can maintain that growth trajectory that they have had. But China, the story also, you can't write it off. I think that many times we make a mistake of saying, well, the growth has come down to below 6%, but the issue is that of what base? You are now talking about a 14 trillion economy. Is no longer a small economy that, let's say, it was 10 years ago. Therefore, the base, 5% of 1 trillion and 5% of 14 trillion is a completely different picture. So China is on steroids, but India is following right on track.
Right close behind it. Now, just lastly, Tshepo, if we look at BRICS, just take a step backwards and look at the BRICS bloc, is it a bit more about politics than about economics, which is supposed to actually be the focus of the bloc coming together, about economically bringing up all of its members? It's
a combination of both. It's a combination of issues of security, it's a combination of the issues of politics, and of course, in the guise of multilateralism, but also in terms of the issues of the economy. One of the things, my own view is that very soon, I think the heads of state need to establish a BRICS secretariat. So we now have the new development bank that has got offices headquartered in Shanghai. We hear of Russia now also wanting to have a regional office, as well as Brazil wanting to have a regional office. So I see a situation whereby there will be regional offices, not just only in South Africa, within the BRICS nations. However, on the other hand is that the BRICS nations themselves, or the BRICS, they need to have a secretariat, because the United Nations has got a secretariat, SADC has got a secretariat, many other of the multilateral organizations have got a secretariat. And that is to ensure that in between summits, a lot of work can be done to ensure that you concretize whatever that the leaders agree to. If I look at the declaration, a 20-page of declaration statement that was issued, that will be coming out of this one here, it necessitates the need for a secretariat to ensure that those issues are just not just talk, but actually we can be able to step back and evaluate the progress that is being made and measure if indeed we are being effective or if we are not being effective, and make whatever corrections that need to be there. And lastly, I would say that the new development bank, the biggest challenge that they face is to be fully funded to the tune of $200 billion, which is what they were looking at. And until that until new development bank is fully funded, we will not really readily see its actual impact on the economies of the BRICS nations.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Khadima, for joining us in studio. Also a pleasure talking to you. Tshepo Khadima, the political analyst. Remember that the conversation does continue online, so you can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @AfroWorldView. Now, my colleague, Mr. Bopalam, was up next with your business. From myself and the team behind the scenes, thank you so much for tuning in and staying with us. Salang.